The biggest problem people have on exam days is, I want you to do a couple of things. Pay attention to the questions, answer all the parts of questions, and answer the question. There's going to be people in here that come up with great answers, and you get zeros because they're not answers to that question, they're just answers to something else, okay? And so, pay attention to the question. So if I ask you what color is the sky, what do? Blue. Do you have to go on and ramble on about why it's blue? No. Say blue, period, move on to the next thing. Okay? If I want you to explain something, I'll say what color is the sky and then explain to me why it's blue. And then you would go on talking about different wavelengths of light and molecular makeup of the atmosphere and stuff like that. So pay attention to what's being asked, and be careful about going on and on and on. Because if you answer the question correctly in one sentence and then you go on and on and on and you say a bunch of wrong things, then I realize, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. So you'll lose the point. So pay attention to what the question is being asked and answer that, but also answer it completely. If I want you to explain something, I'll say explain. Otherwise, don't. Okay? Yeah.
Can you explain treatments of the detection, agency, and development of incidents?
That's a lot. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so that's what we were talking, resistance to AZT. That was an example. That was also an example of microevolution. That's an example of natural selection. Okay, so you change the rules of the game, and the organism responds. Not individual organisms, but what? Populations of organisms are responding and changing. Viruses are dying, other ones are coming into existence. Okay, but the nature of the population level characteristics, emergent properties of populations, those are the things that are changing. So we were talking about emergent properties. They may be the frequencies of alleles. Okay. Individual humans don't express that. It's a characteristic of populations, okay? And so it's an emergent property of populations that individuals don't have, and it's those kinds of terminology and characteristics that we're talking about, okay? So it's examples of stuff that we started talking about in other contexts, but when we were talking about HIV, it kind of introduced some of those things and told us why it's important to understand it that way. Some other things that you can think of. Also, you're responsible for those first two readings. Has everybody read those things? Are there things that on those readings that you want? This is your chance to talk about them now, if you want to talk about what the points of those papers were. Yeah.
The second reading, what was that about? Because it had like ads in it. I don't know if that was like part of the...
No, you don't have to answer questions about the ads. I think there's some nice binocular ads and stuff in there.
I got like lost.
Can somebody, what's your name?
Jonathan.
Can somebody help out Jonathan and point out some of the major points? The first one was just kind of an introduction to a central figure in our class and his history and the development of ideas and why that person figured something out and other people didn't, but it was kind of a reiteration of some of the stuff that we spent multiple days on. This other paper by Stephen Gould, The Tales of a Feathered Tail, it's pretty good. It's not very long. You're right, there are binocular heads. But there are some real important points in there that actually support stuff that we've talked about already. Can anybody voice one of the bigger points in that paper, or give a brief 2 or 3 sentence summary what it was about? It was talking about what kinds of organisms. Was he talking about things that live today? Not so much. Things that lived in the past. How do we know anything about those organisms that lived in the past? Yeah, so if we get that far, that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today. But what kinds of organisms, what kind of fossils was he talking about? Fish? Huh? Yeah, right, and more generally reptiles, because it's not really clear if those, the things that he was talking about are a group of reptiles. When you think of reptiles, think of a big phylogenetic tree. There's a branch with a bunch of little branches and twigs on it, and that's a group of reptiles that people have given a name to that are called dinosaurs. There are other things closely related to it that look similar to dinosaurs to you and me, but they're not dinosaurs. One of those lineages developed a strange kind of scales. Okay, so their scales varied, and we call those different kind of scales on this one other branch of reptiles what? Feathers, yeah. So what's a major function of feathers today in birds? Yeah, in fact, they can't do it without that. So you can take a bird that flies really well and pull off the feathers and then go up to the top of this building and throw it off, and it's going to go straight down. Okay, so that tells you what? Those feathers are pretty important to its flight. Okay? Is that why that lineage of reptiles got feathers to fly? Did they get feathers because they needed to fly? No, they don't need to do anything. They're doing just fine. Okay? But you can't go from no feathers to feathers that work for flying pretty fast, can you? That's not going to happen right away. So what is his explanation for the origin of feathers in reptiles? If it's not for flight, even though they use it for flight today, it could be for something else. So what was one of the, what? Probably not, but maybe. Yeah. So I was thinking about some trying to get you, and you've got big clothes on. It's harder to get to. Yeah. And yeah, very likely thermoregulation. Okay, so you're a lineage of reptiles that maintain. We use the term warm-blooded. You maintain a higher body temperature than the ambient temperature out there, and so individuals that had bigger, fluffier scales, you can imagine, might do better than other individuals that don't have so much. And so you get this covering of these big, fancier scales that we would call feathers. And so you have this lineage of reptiles that are covered with feathers. And some of those can be long, and some of those could be short. And then once you have those can get picked up for uses for other things. So it's true of almost everything that you could think of. The functions that characteristics have now are so very commonly not the same functions that they ended up having at the beginning. Okay, so just because something has a function today, that doesn't mean why it originated. And so it's a very common evolutionary situation that something comes into existence through one selective pressure, and now it's there and it gets picked up for other uses. Okay? I mean, I can look around the room here and think of some examples of that too. Why do we have I don't have much anymore. Why do we have hair on top of our heads? Or why do mammals have hair? It's probably the same thing, right? So yeah, thermoregulation. Okay? But now look at Homo sapiens. Are we covered with hair? Yeah, we're still covered with hair. We still have the same number of follicles our ancestors have, and it's really wimpy. Does this do a lot for thermoregulation? Not so much, okay? And so that hair actually gets picked up for other uses. We still have hair on the tops of our heads, but what's that all about?
Sun.
Yeah, a lot of it's protection from the sun. Why do we lose all the rest of the hair on our body? Well, even before clothes, people, again, this is something we'll talk about later, people did one of the few characteristics, there's a few characteristics that are very Homo sapiens. One of them is the dexterity that we have with our hands. Another is this sophisticated brain other things on earth have really fancy brains. Nothing like this. Another thing that's very Homo sapiens is something called endurance bipedalism. Okay, nothing can outrun good human. Okay, when I'm talking about outrun, I mean outlast and run long enough. Almost everything else is faster than a human being over the short, but over the long distance, really nothing can beat a human being, especially one that has forethought and can predict the future, and that's an old way of hunting. To just chase something until it completely overheats and just lays down and looks at you with glassy eyes, and then you just take a pointed stick and shove it into its gut, and now you've got something to eat. But and we can do that because we do something, we sweat. Okay, we thermoregulate and we dump heat through sweating, and these other organisms don't do that. And that really works when we don't have lots of hair, okay? But we also have this hair and we use it for other things. What's something that people use hair for in modern Homo sapiens? What did you say? Yeah, styling. It conveys stuff about you on purpose or inadvertently. Okay, and we'll talk about something later on in this semester that deals with sexual selection, and your hair says something about you that whether you realize it or not, you pick up on it, and it has a lot to do with genes getting passed on in some individuals of one sex versus other individuals of other sex. And so the point being that characteristics may evolve or come into existence for one purpose, but once they're there, they get picked up for lots of other things, okay? And often it's very different from the reason why it came into being in the first place. So that's one of the points of that article. So feathers are essential for flight, but that doesn't mean that that's why they came into existence in the first place. So very likely something like thermoregulation, but also feathers come in different colors, and so these organisms, they could use them for communication. You know, just like we saw the color patterns in butterflies, they use those things to communicate to other organisms, but they also use them to communicate to each other within sexes. So colored scales could also be used for communication. Okay? And that's another, maybe it came into being first for thermoregulation, and then they vary in color, and now they get picked up for use in communication. Okay? What's another thing about flight in those organisms? What's one of the hypotheses about the evolution of flight in some of those organisms that he talked about in that paper? So there's an organism in there called Caudipteryx, which means feathered tail. So it's a reptile-looking thing, and it's covered with feathers, but it doesn't fly, and it runs around on the ground. It's not that big, but it's a bipedal, feather-covered reptile. And one of the points is that maybe this is something that got feathers and has always been bipedal. Another possibility is that we went from unfeathered reptiles to feathered reptiles to flying feathered reptiles to bipedal non-flying feathered reptiles. Is that possible? Yeah. Okay. Just because you go one direction and evolve flight, does that mean you can't go back to being non-flying? No. We saw that in examples with HIV. So there's not just because there's not some goal that you're trying to get to be something that flies, and once you get there, you've made it, you don't change. Okay, are there bipedal flightless birds today?
Yes.
Yeah. Like what?
Ostrich.
The ostrich, yeah. That came from feathered flying ancestral birds that came from feathered non-flying reptiles. Okay? So one of the points of that paper is why should that be such an odd thing to be the case? It's happened before, and it hadn't just happened once in birds, it's happened multiple times in birds, the development of flightlessness in birds. And in fact, if you look at that Caudipteryx rendering in the painting, it's quite a lot like an ostrich or other emus or flightless things that you may be familiar with. Okay? Can anybody think of some other points from that paper? Are the flying reptiles better than the non-flying reptiles? No, not necessarily, yeah, just because you have something that other things have doesn't make you better. Also, don't think of, so we have birds coming from reptiles, or let's say birds are on the part of the phylogenetic tree, the reptilian phylogenetic tree, and this seems to be the most likely to be the case, that this big branch of the phylogenetic tree of reptiles that we call dinosaurs is also the branch that has the birds on it, okay? But don't think of the wholesale transformation of dinosaurs into birds. What happened? One little twig in there, one lineage gave rise to these other splitting lineages that gave rise to birds. So only one little small piece of dinosaurdom gave rise to birds. Okay? So it's not one bunch of things doesn't turn into something else. One lineage gives rise to something else. Again, think bushes, think trees, don't think ladders and lines. Okay, so somebody may, it's even like bacteria. Okay, bacteria gave rise to, the things that we have today, so why are there bacteria still around? I thought they turned into something else. No, that's not how it works, right? These things don't become something else, they don't turn into something else, they give rise to lineages that vary over time and become something else. It's a very different way of thinking of things. So that's one of the things he's talking about here, is you got to think bushes, you got to think these branching patterns and understand what's becoming something else. Okay? Let's see. Are birds dinosaurs? Some people call them that. Are they right or wrong? No. Yeah, maybe they're maybe they're on a branch of the phylogenetic tree that we call the dinosaurs, but they have that lineage that gave rise to a bunch more has changed so much. It's so morphologically different that we call them something else. Okay, so we call them birds. They have a different name, they are something else. And so when people say, oh, the dinosaurs didn't go extinct because birds are still alive, well, they did, okay? But that one lineage that came from dinosaurs is still in existence, but they're not dinosaurs, okay? It's like our dogs. We don't call them wolves, and we don't call mammals reptiles, even though they have ancestors of such. They're so different that we call them something else. So there is some importance there to this morphological change and characteristics that we use to define these groups, and they change so much that we call them something else. And that's another point that he's making in that paper. Let's see. Anybody got any questions on those readings? Because I'm going to think of something to ask you on Wednesday. Yeah. Oh, I don't know, because I'll probably get it done on Wednesday morning. But your class is so big, I'd love to just give you like a 6 to 10 page exam where you just answer questions and write. But I'll never get it graded. Okay, so I've got to be realistic. So it'll be somewhere between 20 and 30 multiple choice questions. Okay, those I can grade fast. But that's kind of cheesy, multiple choice questions. Because like I said, remember how many people you ever met on the street, they ask you, what color is the sky? A, blue, C, yellow, or D, red. Nobody does that. They just ask you a question. So I will also have some things, so I'll just ask you some questions and you pay attention to the question and ask and answer them. But again, there can't be too many of those because it just takes forever to grade. So that's about, so expect a bunch of multiple choice questions and then just some regular questions. And again, you're gonna write on the paper I give you, don't bring any of those stamped on things, you don't need any of that stuff. Yeah,
You know when you talked about how the birds turning into dinosaurs because they changed so much?
Uh-huh.
Is that like transformation? Like how there's
it's not just
transform-
like transformation, it is, right? So we have multiple lineages of these things, dinosaurs, that have been around for 250 million years. Those things that we would classify as dinosaurs, big things and small things. Those lineages are diversifying and transforming, okay? One of those diversification events give rise to a lineage that develop feathers and end up changing so much and developing these things, feathers and flying, that we call them something very different, and birds, okay? So diversification is taking place. There are still lineages of dinosaurs that exist up until 65 million years ago, but 150 million years ago, we get one of those branches giving rise to these things that we call birds, okay? All those dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. Those birds did not. We'll look at some phylogenies later on in this class and we'll see that they were quite diverse, and lots of the lineages of things that we would call birds and their relatives disappeared, but one of those lineages made it through that extinction event, and then of course continued to what? Transform and diversify into the 9,000 species of birds that we have today. Yeah.
So would it be safe to say that God diversified and transformed?
Yes, that's what lineages do. They do that and something else. Yeah, they transform. So within change, within a lineage is transformation, and any time one lineage becomes two, that's a diversification event. And now you have transformation and you have transformation. But if this transformation has nothing to do with this transformation, what's going to happen to those two things? They're going to diverge from one another and become more and more different the longer that they are apart. And then what you did was you went from one kind of thing to two kinds of things, okay? And that, what we just described there, has happened billions and billions of times in the history of the earth. Okay, so, and then lineages also get to the point where if you've got no more individuals, they all disappear, that lineage is done. And so that lineage is something that went extinct. And so we use that with respect to things at the species level and higher that no longer exist. There was a time in the past when they existed, and then they no longer go past that. So they give rise to nothing. They are the ancestors of nothing, right, that exists today. Anything else on those readings? Or anything else before we move on to new stuff? All right. Well, I hope I got enough to fill today. I originally put some images about comparative anatomy on the Moodle site, because I was thinking, let's talk about that next. Remember, we were talking about some fields of understanding that help us understand evolutionary biology or gave rise to our understanding. So we've talked about natural selection, we've talked about artificial selection, we've talked about some examples of natural selection like mimicry. And so I want to talk about comparative anatomy and biogeography and paleontology. I think it's a more natural fit to talk about paleontology today, and then we'll save comparative anatomy for the next part, and then biogeography for the next part. And remember, this stuff, I mean, you can use stuff that you're going to learn today on the exam, but we're not going to have at least stuff that we introduced today. But we could still mention paleontology, right? Because we already brought that word up. All right? What I want to do is I want to run through some pictures, and then I'll get to a point before they're done where we're going to stop and then answer some other questions. So, these are already on the Moodle site for you again. I can't even see anything. They're clear. So there are all kinds of things that we can think of as fossils. What we're going to mostly show you here, I'm going to show you some examples of real fossils. Fossils are easy to find. We have lots here in Southern California. There are places within walking distance of here, if you don't mind walking very far, where you can go and find fossils. The things that you're most familiar with are bones, big bones of large animals. One of the reasons for that is that hard parts of organisms fossilize much easier than soft parts of organisms. So once animals and plants got very hard parts, they really start showing up in the fossil record. So hard parts are things like bones and teeth. Teeth are really tough. They'll last longer than bones. And parts like shells. But there are fossils, good fossils of things that were completely soft-bodied things. And there are about a half a dozen really good fossil deposits in the world, probably the most famous one being the Burgess Shale in Canada that goes back 500 million years, before things had bones, before things, when things were just starting to develop shells. But the substrates that they're in are extremely fine-grained silts. And just like photographs on film, I know we don't use film that much anymore, or if you're working on Photoshop and making a drawing, you deal in resolution. So sediments that fossils are in that are made up of lots of big pieces that are really sandy, those are really low resolution things. They're very pixelated, okay, because the pieces that they're in are big pieces. But we have rocks that are made out of very powdery substrates like mud and silt. And those things, those are like really fine, high DPI images. And so you get very good resolution even on some things that are very soft-bodied organisms. So we do have fossils that go way back, and we have some fossils that are well over a billion years old from things that are microorganisms. But you can think of fossils as remains or traces. Sometimes there's not even the indication of a part of an organism, but there's indications that an organism has been there. What would be an example of a trace fossil? Yeah, a footprint would be one, or a burrow in the substrate, or let's say a piece of petrified wood that insects have been burrowing in, and once it's petrified, those traces, those trails, those tunnels, all of those things are still there, and you can hold them in your hand and look at them, and they're indicative of organisms. They may not be fossilized parts of organisms, but they're the fossilized markings that organisms have left. Also, these things that are true fossils, the object is gone. Okay, even those things that you dig up, and it may be the femur of some organism, and the femur is 4 feet long. That bone is gone. Okay, that material, the bone material, is all gone. It's been mineralized. All that material has been replaced by minerals, and it's become lithified. It's stone. Okay, so it's turned into something else. But these minerals have taken the place of the bone, and they've taken the place of the bone in the same place that the bone was. And so even though you have something that's literally a rock, it's in the exact same shape and morphology of the bone or the shell. So sometimes you get mineral replacement of objects, and they become stone objects that are in the same shape and the same size and everything of whatever it is. Okay, sometimes these hard parts leave impressions. Sometimes they are negative impressions, sometimes they are positive impressions. Sometimes they are, it's like taking a mold of something and opening it up and looking at the pieces, or sometimes it's a casting of that piece. You get both things. Some kinds of objects get minerals deposited around them, and so they end up in a concretion or a ball of rock, and you have to break that open, and then you can see the impression of whatever that particular thing is. There are other things that get trapped in other kinds of material besides stone that can become semi-lithified, and exists for millions of years, and then you can go back and see or find remains of objects in these things. And we'll look at some of those. We'll look at some of those things today to give you an idea of, again, of what real fossils look like. Okay, so we have fossils, and then this entire library of fossils that are known to human beings that people have discovered and described and written about. All of this makes up what we call the fossil record. Okay, so the fossil record really gets bigger every day. The fossil record was pretty good in Charles Darwin's day, but nothing like what we have now. So people have been studying fossils in his time for 100 or 200 years up to that. And actually the ancients, people from thousands of years ago, they knew of fossils also, and they had varying ideas as to what they were. But this whole record of the past conditions and of objects from the past is known as the fossil record. Also from the fossil record, you can learn about what with respect to organisms? You can learn most obviously about their morphology, right? So you can look at the skeleton of something that's preserved in the fossil record and learn about the morphology of those bones. What are some other things that you can learn about prehistoric life from the fossil record?
Habitat.
Yeah, how can you learn about habitats from the fossils?
The sediment that they're in.
Say again?
The sediment that they're in.
Yeah, so one part of it's the sediment that they're in. So you can see, you can equate certain kinds of deposits with certain habitats. We'll see that the easiest way and the most readily way that things become fossilized is they get buried by sediments in water. You know, at the mouths of rivers we talked about, in lakes and streams and places where the water slows down, and at ocean shores, lake shores, things like that. We talked about water carrying sediments and carrying objects, and they're always dumping sediments when the water slows down. That's the most of the fossils that you can think of or you're familiar with were generated in those ways. So when you find those, you at least know what? That at that particular place, at that particular time, and we may get to today about figuring out how we find out how long ago something was, there was what there? There was water, there was an aquatic habitat. Also, the kinds of fossils that you find. What if you find in a fossil deposit, you find tons of ferns and palms and things like that? What does that tell you? There were lots of ferns and palms growing there. What do you know about habitats that have lots of ferns and palms? Are they wet places or dry places? Yeah, they're wet places. Those kind of plants require lots of water. So in fossils, I don't care what the conditions are today, but you at least know at that place, at that time, it was a very wet place. Okay? Other things that are kinds of plants that are indicative of dry climates, if you find fossils of those, it tells you about those past conditions. It also tells you about the distributions of organisms, not just their morphologies, but their distributions. You see these kinds of things here, you see these kinds of things there. Sometimes you see the same thing in very different places. How can that be? Okay, yeah. And if they're the same thing, how can they be really far apart? Yeah, they could have moved when they were alive and colonized different places. Can fossils move after they become fossils? Oh yeah, they can. They can move long ways. Okay, and we'll talk about that when we talk about biogeography, when we talk about studying the distribution of plants and animals. We can also use the fossil record to study the distributions of plants and animals. And using those distributions is one of the pieces of evidence that people use to figure out that the pieces of the earth move around. They don't always stay in one place. Okay, there's a whole bunch of earthquakes that took place earlier or late last week around the Salton Sea. So I think we have a heightened chance of the big one between now and Tuesday or Wednesday or something like that. So, I don't know. The Prepare yourself. It's gonna happen. But when that happens, pieces of the earth move. They're always moving. But when they move, they carry with them what? The living organisms, but they carry with them their fossils. So we can use the fossil record and look at paleobiogeography to look at past distributions of plants and animals over the landscape. So there are a lot of things you can learn from the fossil record that's not just the morphology of organisms. This is a little cartoon diagram of one by which things get fossilized. So here's a dead gazelle up here. This one's kind of on the landscape, and it gets covered with water. What's actually more common is things end up dying, and they end up getting in running water. And they end up getting washed downstream, and then they settle out. Then they get buried, okay? And you can imagine what takes place from the time it starts off and ends up someplace else. They often get all busted up, and they're not in very good shape. Also, when you got dead animals on the landscape, what happens to dead animals on the landscape? Really fast. There you go. Yeah, well, I mean, flies get to them real fast, and scavengers get to them real fast, and they move parts all over the place. Also, even after things get fossilized, pieces are moving around, and so lots of fossils really aren't in that great a shape. So when you get ones that are in really good shape and are very clean and are very complete, that doesn't happen very often. You can see why, and so those make them all the more valuable. But you get them associated with aquatic habitats and the deposition of sediments, and when they get buried deep enough over long periods of time, multiple layers. Those rocks get lithified. They're not rocks yet, but the sediments get lithified with pressure and temperature, and they become rocks, like sandstone. But the objects that are in with the sediments also get trapped in there, and then those hard parts, most of that other flesh stuff rots away, particularly when you have oxygen available. But those hard parts, they get mineralized, and they become these things that we call fossils, and they exist for millions and millions and millions of years there. And then as the landscape changes, sometimes this stuff gets uplifted and we get new mountains built out of sedimentary rocks. Then you've got these what are now sedimentary rocks exposed on the surface. They get eroded and those fossils get exposed and people can see them and then you can dig them up. So you can go to the Rocky Mountains and you could hike 15,000 feet up in the Rocky Mountains and you find fossils of clams and snails, marine organisms. It's like, how did that happen? Okay, well those things were formed at or below sea level, and those now sedimentary rocks got uplifted and buckled into the Rocky Mountains, and it carries with them those fossils. And so now they're way above sea level. So you can go hike up by the 5 and the 14, and when anybody drive home that way? I mean, you barely move if you're going that way home. But if the sun's still out, look. What you see is the rocks are all banded. Okay, they're not level. They're at an angle because they've been moved around, buckled, and uplifted. But those bands are these strata of sedimentary rocks. Those are great places to go in and look for fossils. You got to bust open a lot of rocks, but they're there. And in some places, they're extremely common. And every shovelful of rock, it's all fossils. Okay. Actually, you can even get there closer. You remember where Browns Canyon is? I'm trying to get my beard. It's right up. Go to DeSoto. Drive up to DeSoto. You drive up to the Santa Susana Mountains. Drive as far as DeSoto goes and get out. There's fossils all over the place. They're all marine fossils. They're oysters and clams and snails and stuff. They're just all over the ground. Okay. So this is a little cartoon showing you, a fossilization process of a large animal that has bones. I've got a bunch of pictures of some real fossils to give you an idea what some of them look like and what they represent. This is a fossil of something called a stromatolite, and it's not a multicellular organism, but these are blue-green algae, and they form mats. They're in very shallow marine environments, and they form mats of blue-green algae, and then those mats grow upon each other, and they grow upon each other. But also when they do that, they incorporate sediments in amongst the algae, sediments get trapped in there. And then these things build up with one another, and the bottom layers with all this sediment, they get compressed and they get hardened. And then this whole structure can get buried and get lithified. And then you see this stratified, these are biostratifications of these blue-green algal mats that have grown one upon another. You can go to Australia today, you can afford the plane ticket and sit there long enough on the plane, and you can see real life living algal mats that are in the form of these, they look like stools that you can go sit on in really shallow marine waters, and those would be these things like these stromatolites. This is way before multicellular life, okay? So this is these are 1.5 billion-year-old fossils. So these represent living organisms 1.5 billion years ago on planet Earth, okay? Way before multicellular organisms. Again, pay attention to the resolution of some of these things. There's lots of detail preserved in fossils. This is a coral, a marine coral from a little over 400 million years ago from Iowa. It's like, what? What's up with that? How much coral is in Iowa today? Not corn, coral. Lots of corn in Iowa. No corals there. What does this fossil tell you about Iowa? Yeah, it used to be. And what kind of water? Yeah, these are marine organisms. So most of all the central part of the United States was all a marine habitat hundreds of millions of years ago. It's not like that today, but it was in the past. So this is even corals that are extant today, not the same species, but they're very similar to this. You can go snorkeling in places that have corals, and this should be a very familiar sight. These things readily fossilize because they have calcium carbonate skeletons. These are Nigerians, things like really little bitty sea anemones, and they make different kinds of houses that they live in, but one of them being calcium carbonate, little enclosures that they live in, and then they build the next ones on top of each other and make these formations. But because they're hard, they readily fossilize, and so we have good fossils of corals. Also, since we're dealing with aquatic environments, there are lots and lots of fossils of fish. This is one from Wyoming, and this is probably from what's called the Green River Formation. And it's just, when you go buy fossil fish in, like at the mall, they used to have these stores that sold fossils. Do they have any of those stores still? I don't go to the mall so much. And it was like some nature shop. And if you're buying fish fossils, they're almost certainly from the Green River Formation up in Wyoming. And these things are beautiful. It's like taking the fish and then smushing it, or putting ink on it and smashing it on paper, and you can see it and look at it. These are fine sandstones, and so the resolution is really good. And there's lots of insect fossils too. So this is a group of a family here. This Elcanidae. This doesn't exist anymore. It's an extinct family, but it's kind of like a what? It's kind of like a I can't hear what you guys say. I don't know why I ask these broad questions. I just ask one person at a time. It's kind of like it's close to grasshoppers. It has these big jumping hind legs, so it's jumping. It has really big wings. It has really long antennae though. Grasshoppers have really short antennae, about that long. It has really long antennae though, more like a cricket or a katydid. But this is from Brazil, and this is in really good shape. It's not all busted up. And so that's what some insects look like 120 million years ago in another part of the world. There are lots of plant fossils, leaves, again in water and getting covered with sediment. This is from not that long ago, from 35 million years ago. This is something that you could go and find right on campus here. The genus Salix are willows. So this is identified as belonging to the same genus as modern day willows. Apparently it doesn't have a species name. Probably you can't figure it out from this leaf. Where does this name come from? We like to talk about names. Anybody know something that came from willows?
Salicylic acid?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's salicylic acid, but you buy it in the store, it's called aspirin. Yeah, so lots of our medicines come directly from plants, or they came from molecules that people make, but they got the idea from plants, and that's something that came from these kinds of plants, and the name salicylic acid comes from, they came from Salix, in the family Salicaceae. But again, also these fossils too, they have very good resolution. You can hold them under the microscope and look at fine structure in these fossils. And it's almost like holding something in your hand. Now that Salix is something very similar to the stuff that lives today. So some fossils represent things that are similar to things that live today. Some are kind of like things that live today, and others are very different from things that live today. And they represent groups on the phylogenetic tree, a big piece of which doesn't exist anymore. This looks like a kind of a scary, this is like an amphibian too. And so that's like the scariest amphibian. You think of frogs and toads and salamanders. This is from 270 million years ago in Texas. Yeah, they got big stuff in Texas, but these things don't exist anymore. Thank goodness. This is, let's see, there's no, what kind of organism is this kind of like? Huh? Not a monster. It's a little rhinoceros looking, but it's certainly a big mammal that has two real big horns here on its head. And this is from not that long ago. This is only from a few tens of millions of years ago, and this fossil comes from Egypt. Also, some other things that we can learn from fossils. What did this organism probably eat? Yeah, looks like it ate plants. All of its teeth are these big, bulky, grinding kinds of tools for eating plants. This thing didn't go out and catch fish. This thing didn't fly around and get insects out of the air. This thing doesn't go and sip nectar from flowers. This thing is a big grazer, and it ate plants, and it probably ate a lot of plants, and it probably ate some pretty big, tough plants. It could grind up branches and twigs and stuff like that. Here's something from really not that long ago, from less than a few tens of thousands of years ago. This is like the fossils, if we really call them fossils, I don't know if we should, the things that are in La Brea. So you can drive toward downtown and go to the tar pits, the La Brea tar pits, and see stuff that lived in Los Angeles just a handful of few tens of thousands of years ago. Things that lived here even when people showed up here 15,000 years ago. And so this is something very similar from tars in Alaska, and this is very similar to things that live today. Here in the United States, we have bison. So the bison, the thing that people call buffalo, but they're not buffalo, that live here in North America, one of the most iconic North American animals. We had other kinds that lived in the past. This is one from Alaska. These things don't exist anymore, but their close relatives do. I'd say that some of these, I don't know if we call them fossils, because in the stuff at La Brea, I'm pretty sure the bones are still there. They're just in asphalt, and they didn't rot. And so they've been there. And you want to, that's a great, everybody that lives in Los Angeles, you should go there once, and at least once, and see the stuff that lived here not that long ago. And there's lots of it. Here's something, some kind of artiodactyl, like an elk, a deer, moose, those goats and sheep, those kinds of animals. But this is one that doesn't live today. This has a neat, not only it has these horns that would have antlers on them, but it has a nice big horn coming off the front of its snout with a big fork on it. You know, everything that looks like that today. And people fossilized, again, our bones. This is our closest relative. So again, a different species in our genus. These are Neanderthals, and these are just a few tens of thousands of years old. So in this part of the world, our species were around at the same time that this species existed, and these went extinct, and our species continues to exist today. Anybody have any idea what this is?
No.
No, it's a bat, yeah. So these things show up about 50 million years ago. It's a bat. And bats, they're very distinctive, and they fly not with their arms, they fly with their hands. Okay, you get a hold of a bat skeleton, the wings are all hands. They got little short arm bones, but their finger bones are huge. And they've got 5 fingers, a little claw that they can crawl around with is their thumb, and then between their other fingers they have skin, and they fly around like this. And so this is very distinctive. This is very obviously a bat skeleton. When you take and make skeleton specimens out of these and take them apart, they look like little people, but they have little stumpy legs and they have these giant arms. You know, if they could walk around, they just have these big, these big hands, which makes it look like most of their arms are like that. Then here's some other things related to stuff that we know of today. These are graptolites. I think this word has to do with like a drawing, because it looked like people were drawing in the stone, and they've known about these things for hundreds of years. But these are things that are a little bit related to chordates, the group that we belong to. But these are marine organisms from hundreds of millions of years ago. And then we think about things that are very different from anything that we have today. This was a very successful group of organisms in the past. These are a group of arthropods called the trilobites. You can go out to the desert here in Southern California and you can find tons of trilobite fossils. Most of them are just pieces because, like other arthropods, they shed their exoskeletons and they come off in pieces. And these things are aquatic organisms and they just wash downstream and they get in huge piles of debris and then they get fossilized. And so a lot of trilobite fossils are just piles and piles of pieces. So on a piece of rock, it's just pieces all over. But some of them come out really nice, and they're whole things. These things are all gone. They disappeared. I think these things disappeared 250 million years. They existed for hundreds of millions of years. They're extremely successful, very widespread, very diverse, and then they disappeared and they're gone. We don't have anything like them today. Horseshoe crab is not that. It's not a trilobite, but it is an arthropod, and it's somewhat similar in that it has a hard carapace like that, and they have little compound eyes on the top of the carapace. I think both of those have that. Horseshoe crabs, this neat-looking thing in the genus, I think it's called Limulus. They're marine organisms, and they come up to spawn on the beach, and we have fossils of those things, similar body forms that go way back, so it's almost like some kind of a living, people would call it like a living fossil. It's a body form that's been around for a long time, and yet it's something that still lives today. And you pick them up and turn them over. They kind of hinge just the back of the main carapace, and then underneath there's all these legs and little claws, and they look kind of like crabs, but they have this really big hard carapace over them. They had an exhibit at the Natural History Museum. I went and looked at it a couple of weeks ago, and I think it left yesterday. So these aren't dinosaurs, but they're reptiles, and they did something cool. They flew. Yeah. So we were talking a little bit about birds already. There's only 4 flying, self-propelled flight organisms in the history of Earth. The first ones were what? The first flying organisms. I'm not talking about gliding. What? Insects. Yeah, remember insects are great? They do everything first. Yeah, insects. Then it was these, flying reptiles. And then we got birds, and then we just talked about them, one group of mammals, the bats. That's it. And one of those is gone. So these flying reptiles are extinct. And these things are pretty neat. So they had a great exhibit. Some of these things were as big as airplanes. Huge. And they got models of them there, and can you imagine what that, you've seen that, it's like big surprise. What was that last Jurassic Park movie? Yeah, they make these horrible, giant dinosaurs, and then they have cages full of these things. Oh, big surprise, they get out and start terrorizing everybody. But there's a scene where there's a bunch of these flying reptiles. Man, they're just tearing people up. And so these things, they have these long, gangly wings, and they're built very differently. These things evolved flight independently of bats, it's their hands, right? Okay? And skin between their fingers. These things, it's also their arms. So here's the humerus, radius, and ulna. Here's the wrist, and then these are the finger bones. And in the pterosaurs, this finger is gone. This finger, the ring finger, is really long. And then here's like thumb, index finger, middle finger. The ring finger is this one. Okay? It's the same bones, the same digit. It's just super long. And then from that is what the skin is attached to, and then goes back here to the base of the wing. And so they're flying really, really like this with this real big, long ring fingers. Okay? And so when we talk about comparative anatomy, these are the kinds of things that we look at. How did these come up with flight? Well, they actually did it in a very different, they built wings in a very different way. So they built them with this long finger, bats built them with this. Birds, do birds have fingers? Oh yeah, they do. All of these vertebrate flyers came from pentadactylous ancestors. In birds, I think both of these two fingers are gone. These three fingers, you can still see them. Okay, and that's what the feathers are attached to, and then they fly like that. And insects are built completely differently. Theirs is kind of like an evagination of the body wall. So like my shirt's made of fabric on either side, but if you pull it out like this, it can make something that's flat, but it's like a membrane and a membrane. And so that's what they use. That's how they built wings. In a very, very different way. So these are all different independent things of flight that we can learn about from their fossils. And some of these things were little bitty things too. They're all gone. And then here's an example of a trace fossil. One of you mentioned footprints, and so once people knew about the morphology of the feet of some of these big reptiles, you could even identify what they are. And so this one is in Pyretherium, an archosaur reptile that people know of. And here are some footprints that it would have left in some soft substrate, but before it got washed away, it got covered with other sediments and buried. And it got buried with other sediments, and then later on, it gets uplifted after it's been turned to stone, and now you have sediments of different densities, different hardness, and that eroded away, and now you can see this stuff in these layers of lithified sediments. Other kinds of fossils are I mentioned some things that get entrapped in other things besides stone. Amber, there are multiple deposits throughout the world of this stuff called amber, and these were from a few kinds of trees that produce sap, but also in association with aquatic habitats. So this stuff is tree sap. Organisms and parts of organisms get entrapped in this tree sap, and then it ends up in the water and gets buried in sediments and gets preserved and kind of lithified and turns into this hard plastic-like stuff that's amber. People have been harvesting this for a long time and making jewelry out of it, but also people noticed that within it there were organisms trapped. And I've taken amber from stuff that's many millions of years old. So this is Dominican amber, a few tens of millions of years, and you can hold that under a microscope. And if you were looking at this fly here, it's just like holding this fly, a specimen of it, under the microscope, and yet that thing lived tens of millions of years ago. And you can look at all its parts. It's not nice like this when you find it. You have to cut off and buff off all the rough, crappy stuff that's on the outside, but then by buffing it and polishing it, you can see through it. And good ones, some of the poor stuff has dirt in there and bubbles, and it's hard to see stuff, but some of them are very nice. And I've seen amber specimens that have parts of lizards, whole lizards, scorpions, frogs, and also plants and plant parts like pollen that blows in the wind and gets stuck on things. And we know a lot about modern pollen, so you can learn a lot about ecosystems from the past by looking at pollen. pollen, and that stuff gets preserved readily in things like camphor. This stuff is fantastic. And you gotta, again, you've got to agree, there's this fly here. This looks very similar to some of the flies that we have today, and yet this is something that was a long time in the past that you could assign this thing to at least a family. Yeah, this is in, it has a name. It might even be in the family Scatopsidae, but it's in the superfamily Scatopsoidea. And so it looks like modern day Scatopsids to me. Okay, then taking the fossil record that people have had for a few hundred years, people built this. And this is called the geologic time scale. And so in Darwin's day and in Lyell's day, they had a geologic time scale, except it was like this, but it was missing something important that we'll talk about in a minute. And what people did was they looked at stuff from the past, and another thing that you can learn about fossils is not just their geographic distributions, but their temporal distributions. So certain kinds of organisms live throughout this certain period of time, and they disappear, and then other organisms exist through these different periods of time. And people, by knowing that you can go back in time by going to deeper and deeper strata, and also matching those strata in one parts of the world with other parts of the world, we can build a picture of the history of the Earth, of what lived at certain times and what things disappeared at other times. And that's what this is all about. So over here are things like the first mammal-like reptiles. And here are the first dinosaurs. So we had reptiles for a long time before we got these things, dinosaurs. The first placental mammals. The first fish that show up, these jawless things. So the first jawed fish here. So people put these things, these events, in order. Also, during these events, anytime a real big change took place, people would take and draw a line. When some big event happened in the history, particularly of life on Earth, when a big event happened, people would draw a line and give a different name to that other piece of time. It's like little, in the life of a human, you're like an embryo and a feet. I guess we don't have to count those. When they're born, you're a newborn, and then what's next? You're a toddler, and then just a child, and then you become a... Who said monster before? This is about the same monster. Yeah. And you become a teenager and a young adult, and then you become an adult, and then you become an old geriatric adult, and then you turn back into looking like the day you were born. So it goes around in a circle. But we divide up human life into these periods of times that we give names to. That's what these words are over here. And you don't have to learn these, you don't have to memorize these. I want you to know that they exist, some of them that you know. We already talked about Jurassic Park, okay? So this is like the age of the dinosaurs. Here's a period of time that's called the Jurassic. Lots of these names come from geographic places on Earth where these fossils were studied or first discovered. But the history of life on Earth is divided up into really crude pieces of time, and then within those crude pieces, more succinct or more specific pieces of time. So here's some really crude pieces of time, like the Proterozoic, the Phanerozoic, and this is also continuing the Phanerozoic time. So those are eons, really crude pieces of time. Then we have eras, like, what is Paleozoic? Old animals. Mesozoic, the middle kind of animals. Cenozoic, modern animals. Yeah, real fancy, right? And then within those there are divisions, and within those divisions. And then if we could look at some modern geologic timescale divisions, even these have little pieces that mark changes, significant changes in the history of life on Earth. We've got 1 minute left. This is very much like the geologic time scale that Charles Darwin would have had access to, except for one thing. What's on here that he wouldn't have had? No. There's two kinds of time on this diagram. There's relative time. The first land plants existed before the first dinosaurs. That's relative time. This happened in a certain time relative to something else. What's this column? That's absolute time. Charles Darwin would have had access to relative time. This happened before this happened after this. But absolute time, people didn't know that yet. It wasn't until relatively recently that people would say, oh, this is the first fish with jaws show up on Earth. Well, when was that? Well, relative to reptiles, it was before reptiles, but in absolute time, we're talking, let's say, 420 million years ago. We got an exam on Wednesday, and when we come back on Monday, we'll answer that question. How do we come up with these numbers? Okay?